older or the elder and Clark the younger. So this is my son Adam.
This is my dad Art.
And that is actually a picture in Tokyo at the National Sumo Wrestling Tournament. So back in 2019 when my son took me to Japan. So let's not stay on that picture for very long. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we wanted to make this easy for you guys and for the individuals that might be streaming this morning. We taught a class about 3 years and 3 months on Judges in the same format. If you want to view that class or if we reference anything in that class, that first QR code will take you to the YouTube playlist for Judges. For those of us who might be streaming this from home and have any questions during our discussion portions, that middle QR code will text me, and I'll be reading the Bible from my phone, so I'll be getting text messages. So if you have any questions you want to send to me, that middle one will do. And then if anyone is viewing this after the class is over and has questions, that last one will email me. So feel free to use that. And then when we have discussion topics, we'll intentionally leave the middle one up for anyone streaming to be able to reach out to us. You just have to be quick.
Do not text me.
Yeah.
I will not see it during class.
So those are available for you to use. And then we'll probably bring all three of these once again at the beginning of class just for reference real quickly. So if you're streaming, feel free to pause whenever you see this, take a picture, use it as you see fit. All right.
Okay. Where are we? I guess we could go all the way back to Genesis, the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis was about creation and the patriarchs. Exodus was about Moses' life, and it had some instructions about the tabernacle. Leviticus, the Lord spoke to Moses. The law, basically about the priests and the sacrifices. Then Numbers, the people were numbered at the beginning of Numbers, and then Numbers is about the wilderness wandering. They were numbered again at the end of the wilderness wandering. So you got 2 numberings in Numbers. And then Deuteronomy was a second giving or second telling of the law, hence the name Deuto for, second or 2. So it's kind of a copy or a repetition of the law, and it's an explanation of the previous laws. And it was kind of written again for the new generation because the people coming out of the wilderness were not the ones that received the original law. So they, hence Deuteronomy. And then Joshua was about the conquest of the land, the possession of the land, dividing up the land among the tribes and so forth. And then we got into Judges, and we had our class on Judges, and that was how the people were led when they first went into the land. Whenever something would come up, there was a regional judge that God would appoint, and he would lead the people militarily, and he would also, or she, in one case, would judge the people. And then that brings you then to Ruth, which was written during the period of the Judges, and it's a love story that's set during the time of the Judges, and we'll get to a little bit more to Ruth in our class this morning. So that brings us up to 1 Samuel.
And like we said, we've already done Judges. We've got a big red X there. We're going to reference what's happened in Judges because it's important to what's going to be happening in 1 Samuel, right? You don't know where you are until you know where you've been. And Judges is the where you've been to Samuel. Ruth, like Dad said, it's really important to David and his lineage and how he becomes king and his genealogy. But like we said before, we're starting on 1 Samuel. If we were to just broadly label Judges, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings, Judges is the book before the Kings. 1 Samuel is the book about man's king, and 2 Samuel is the book about God's king. And so we're gonna get into the monarchy, the dynasty that is the Israelite kingdom, but realize that we start off on the wrong foot. And we don't get until 2 Samuel where we actually get the king that God wanted, the kingdom that God intended.
You got the book of Judges about the judges, but Samuel was also a judge. He was the last judge before a king was appointed. And then he was the one responsible for anointing the first and the second kings, Saul and David. So that's going to come up in 1 and 2 Samuel, 1st, 2nd. So anyway.
And we don't have any attributed authors to 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Their authorship is a mess of different opinions from different scholars. We're really not going to get too far deep into the authorship of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. But we did want to point out that in Chronicles, the Bible says that the Acts of David were written first from last in the Chronicles of Samuel, the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan, the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad, the seer. And so we might be able to imply that authorship could be attributed to those three men. But that's as far as we're going to go when it comes to authorship.
When 1 and 2 Samuel was originally written in Hebrew, it was a single book. It wasn't two books. It wasn't until the 2nd century BC that when it was translated into Greek that it was split into two books. And actually, when they first translated it, it wasn't 1 and 2 Samuel, it was 1 and 2 Kingdoms. It wasn't until later that they changed the name to 1 and 2 Samuel. So it used to be called not 1 and 2 Kings because you got that later. This was 1 and 2 Kingdoms. And maybe for the confusion there, they changed the name to Samuel. I'm not sure the etymology of the name, but I thought that was a little interesting.
Well, Dad's looking that up. One of the things we want to remember is 1 Samuel deals with Eli. We'll be introduced to him in the first chapter, and then we'll be introduced in the first 3 chapters to Samuel. Like Dad said, they're both judges. We are in a transition period from Judges to Samuel. And so it would make sense that we kind of taper off with Judges with Eli and Samuel. We'll actually see verses where it says when Eli dies, he judged Israel for X number of years. And so when we look at them, we'll consider them judges. What's interesting, though, is they lack the military leadership we typically associate with the judges we see in the book of Judges. And so there's this transition period away from military leaders in the book of Judges into more religious leaders in the book of 1 Samuel that are judges. All right. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to start in Samuel chapter 1. We've used ESV in this first lesson, and both decided we like NASB around 9:30 last night. And so we'll probably be changing to NASB starting in lesson 2, mainly because, and we'll get to some verses where there's some confusion about who God is when they use the personal pronoun him. In the NASB, they capitalize the H in him when they talk about judge or talk about God, Yahweh, and leave lowercase m when they're talking about normal people. It's more confusing in the ESV, and so we'll probably be changing to NASB moving on. But for this lesson, we'll be using ESV and all of these verses that you see up there. Can everyone see that okay? Show of hands, anyone having problems? The font's big enough? Colors are all right? All right. Well, it's probably going to be like that the entire quarter. So now's your time to speak up and say, I can't hear it, or can't see it.
If they can't hear it, we're really in problems.
Okay. Now, this man used to go up year by year from his city. We're talking about Elkanah?
Uh-huh.
Elkanah, to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts of Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. Boy, this first verse in Samuel, this first verse we're looking at in Samuel, sets the stage. The setting is Shiloh. The first main character, Eli, his evil sons, Hophni and Phinehas.
I like this Lord of Hosts as a title. It's used 300 times in the Old Testament, and I don't know that you realize it or not, but hosts is transliterated into English as Sabaoth or Sabaoth, depending upon whether you're using the English or the Hebrew translation of that. But when you see that, the Lord of Hosts, and you see that word later, Sabaoth, and it's found in Romans 9:29, it's found in James 5:4. A lot of times people will think, well, that's just a misspelling of Sabbath, but it's not. It's actually the transliteration of hosts. And the Lord of Hosts 300 times, sometimes it's talking about the Lord of the host of angels, the Lord of the host of the armies. It's used in multiple ways about God as being the Lord of Hosts. But, we even have it in one of our songs, Lord Sabaoth. A Mighty Fortress. It was written by Martin Luther, and this is, if you were to find that in your songbook, this is the second verse of that song, A Mighty Fortress. And so whenever you got, oh, nobody's going to see that, you better go back to the other one.
All right.
That Lord Sabaoth, Jesus Christ it is He, Lord Sabaoth, His name. A lot of times people go, where does this name come from? Well, that's what it's from. The Lord of hosts is translated as Sabaoth. And when you go back to, anyway, we'll have some more to say about that later. Adam wanted me to try and sing this song, but I am not a song leader. But if you were to turn to A Mighty Fortress, is that page 73 in our songbook, or is that a different songbook?
I think that might be a different songbook. It is 73?
It is 73. Right. And read verse 2, you'll see that Martin Luther uses that term to describe the Messiah or Jesus. So
what does Lord of Hosts?
A little tidbit of knowledge there.
What does Lord of Hosts actually mean? He's the Lord of hospitality? No. The Lord of hostesses? No.
No.
He's the Lord of armies. When we think of hosts, we think of angelic armies, which this is the first time it's used. We've gotten through the entire book of Judges, which is really a military book talking about how God empowers judges to defend his people and defeat his enemies. And it's not until Samuel that we actually get a militaristic title for God. Okay? This is important. That we finally give God a militaristic title. He is the Lord of armies. You'll see it translated in some versions, the Lord of angelic armies, but you'll see it here, the Lord of hosts.
We're going to talk in a minute about history, but when you look at the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, Genesis up through First Samuel that we're in this period now, theologians call this salvation history because it's God's history about how He is trying to save His people through winning battles, through supporting faithful men and women. It's called salvation history. And the book of Ruth ends with the name of David, David's successful preparation. It's also, Jesus is the son of David. So it's all leading up to God bringing His Savior to the world. And that even is true in 1 Samuel. So.
All right, so we've talked about God and His title in that first verse, or in verse 3. Let's start talking about Shiloh. I find it interesting. I like Japanese history. The capital of Japan has not always been in Tokyo. It was in Kyoto. And it got moved to a different place. The same can be said for Israel. Jerusalem wasn't always the capital of the Israelite people. And it starts in Shiloh.
Okay, Shiloh is a term used 33 times in the Old Testament. 32 of those times it refers to this city in Ephraim. One time it does not. And this is where I asked Adam's permission to chase a rabbit. So if you go back to the book of Ruth, Ruth in verse 1 says that it was, let me get to verse 1. Now it came about in the days of the judges that there was a famine in the land, and so it gives you the time period that Ruth took place. It's during the judges. Then you get to the last of Ruth, chapter 4, and it ends with, now these are the generations of, and it's going to talk about, the children that Ruth and Boaz, that they have Obed, and then to Obed was born Jesse, and then to Jesse was born David. So that David, King David, who later was the ancestor of Jesus, that came through the life of Ruth and Boaz. But if you look at the rest of that genealogy there, it starts in verse 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, Ram. It gives all those names, but it starts with Perez. Well, who is Perez? Well, Perez, you have to go back to Abraham. Abraham had a son who was Isaac. Isaac's son was Jacob. Jacob's son was Judah. Judah's son was Perez. So he's in the 5th generation of those patriarchs. So then Perez is where Ruth's genealogy starts. So you can trace it from Abraham all the way to David. But Perez is kind of an interesting character because if you know anything about Judah, Judah had 3 sons. And this is where the accountant comes out in me. Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And if you know the laws of inheritance and the laws of succession, the oldest son got a double portion. So Tamar was married to the oldest son, So that meant that he would inherit a double portion. So if he got 3 sons, he would get a double portion. So he'd get 50%. His brother Onan would get 25%, and Shelah would get 25%. Was a wicked man. God killed him. Now, the law of succession said that the next son, Onan, was to go and give an offspring to Tamar, who was then to take care of her in her old age. But he was to replace and would get that 50% succession. But if Onan was not successful in giving her an offspring, then the law of succession showed that now you just had 2 children and you got a double portion. So Onan was going to get a double portion, or 2/3, and Shelah would get 1/3. So if he does not give Tamar a child, he gets 67% of his father's inheritance. If he gives her a child, he gets 25%. Motive? I'm not trying to teach a mystery class here, but, I think there's some motive there for him to do what he did. Financial motive. And so he did what he did. God deemed him as evil and struck him dead also. So then it fell to Shelah, and that's where Judah steps in and says, no, I'm not giving you my 3rd and last son because the first 2 have already died. So then he doesn't give her a son to help her have an offspring. And so that's when God steps in and has her deceive Judah, and Judah gives her a son. And the offspring of that relationship between Tamar and Judah was none other than Perez.
So what does that have to do with Shiloh, Dad?
Aha! I'm glad you asked that question. So now I've got to go back into Genesis. Genesis chapter 40 is where Jacob, remember one of our other patriarchs, is giving prophecies about each of his 12 sons. And one of those prophecies is about Judah. Okay? I got to get to the right place here. Genesis chapter 40. I hope I wrote down that's not the right one. That's Joseph. So where did I? Here we go. 38. No, that's the
49.
story about
Genesis 49:10.
49. Why did I write down 40? Thank you.
Well.
Okay, Genesis 49 is where Jacob, who now his name has been changed to Israel, is giving the prophecies about his sons. And he gives them about Reuben, about Simeon, and then he gets to Judah. And in Judah, it says, your brother shall praise you, your name shall be on the neck of the enemy. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You come down to verse 10. This is still talking about Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Now, the scepter is what the ruler holds. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Now, this is Shiloh. But the Shiloh they're talking about is not Shiloh the city. This is the first of the 33 uses of Shiloh in the Old Testament. This is Shiloh referring to the Messiah. In other words, your family is going to rule until the Messiah comes, who is going to come through your family, by the way, through Judah, through David, through all the way to Jesus. And Shiloh, the Hebrew translation for Shiloh, is tranquil or abundance. It can also mean his gift in a spiritual name. So, excuse me, he whose it is another translation for Shiloh when it's the name of a person and not the name of a place. So it can also mean, in that sense of tranquil or abundance, the peaceful one, or peace in the midst of pain. And I bring all that out to say those are all apt descriptions of the Messiah. And this prophecy that Israel gave to Judah was that he would, through him, he would reign until Shiloh comes, the Messiah. I just thought that was kind of interesting. It's not in 1 Samuel, but it is Shiloh, and Shiloh is in 1 Samuel. So
There you go.
back to the class.
That was a big rabbit.
That was my rabbit that I chased. So.
All right. So let's talk about Shiloh being the home of the tabernacle, because that's where a lot of these first few chapters of Samuel are set in. Hopefully you can see this map. If you remember Bible class, the Israelites cross over the Jordan, and what is the first thing? One of the first things you remember them doing? They cross the Jordan and defeat whom? A little louder. Jericho. And they do it with what? They put something before them. They walk around the city. The Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark.
So what we have here is down here in the south, as soon as they cross the Jordan, they end up using Gilgal as a temporary base. And from Gilgal, they then go to Jericho and defeat Jericho. After some time, they end up moving the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle is a large kind of temporary tent that they were instructed to build in the wilderness. They end up moving the tabernacle from Gilgal to Shiloh. And the picture we have here is what we think it looks like. Now, it doesn't sit in Shiloh for 10 or 20 years. It sits in Shiloh for 300 and nearly 70 years. And so what ends up happening is the articles of the tent, the structure of the tent that was dictated to be used and made by artisans and craftsmen while they're in the wilderness, is repurposed in Shiloh, and they start building more permanent structures. We'll see this in the story of Eli and Samuel. But it looks something like this. They end up taking the tent covering. They still use it. It's now over a large stone structure. The candelabras that were in the tabernacle are still used. They're just now in this large stone structure. There's large beams covered in gold that were used in the tabernacle. Those are still used. They're just now in this large stone structure. And so what ends up happening is Shiloh becomes the de facto capital of the Israelites. It's also the place of worship. We'll see Elkanah and Hannah and the bad wife that starts with a P.
Penina? Yeah.
Penina. They travel to Shiloh in the same way that we see Israelites travel to Jerusalem for feasts and for celebrations and sacrifices. They're doing the same thing. They're going to Shiloh, they're going to the tabernacle, and they're offering gifts. What's interesting is Shiloh is destroyed. And we know this not because of the Bible, but because of the Mishnah. You guys know what the Mishnah is? It's the oral history of the Hebrews. The oral history of the Hebrews said that, Shiloh is destroyed. The Jewish people arrive and then take the tabernacle to Nov or to Nob. And so we'll find in later chapters in Samuel, not this lesson, most likely next lesson, that Shiloh ends up becoming destroyed. But they take all the things that are important, the actual tabernacle pieces that were dictated by God, they wrap them all up in the way that they're supposed to be wrapped up, that they're supposed to be transportable, right? That was the whole part, or the reason of the tabernacle, was this is really easy to pick up and move. They pick it up and they take it, and Shiloh as a city is destroyed. And we'll get to that a little later.
Let me see the point. While we're on this map, I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
Ramah right there is where Samuel lived. Bethel, Shiloh is about 20, 25 miles north of that. Jerusalem's about 10 miles south of that. Bethlehem's another 5 miles south. That's where David and later Jesus were born. We're running out of time, so I won't go into the rest of that. But his father, Elkanah, actually came from this Ramath Zophim, but he lived right here. Mizpah and Bethel were beautiful places. They were some of the highest places in the country. They had beautiful views and so forth. That's where things took place, like Bethel was, not Bethel, Mizpah was where Joshua made the sun stand still, for instance. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into all the geography there. So,
All right. Our next section was God directs history. We're probably going to skip this real quick. The important point I want to make, if you remember our previous class on Isaiah, prophecy from our vantage point is really fascinating and interesting. Someone has predicted what's going to happen later on in the world, right? When we have a prophet of God saying, the Assyrians are going to come take you into captivity, and when it actually happens, it's amazing. From God's perspective, prophecy is just God keeping his promises. God is powerful enough to always keep his promises. My son asks me, Dad, will you play catch with me tomorrow? And I can make a promise. I don't always have the power to keep my promise. I'm not so powerful that other things get in the way and I can't keep the promise to my son. For me, history and prophecy is just God showing his power that when he says he's going to do something in the future, he is so powerful, he's always going to make it happen. Does that make sense? So when we talk about history, when we talk about what happens in these chapters, God is directing history because he's powerful enough to say, X is going to happen, and nothing's going to stand in my way for making sure that happens.
one historian wrote that biblical history is his story, history. So I like that AT person. We're not going to get into what all these other guys said about history. It was interesting, but we don't have time for that. But Samuel did. He reminded the people who they were. He reminded them of where they had been, and he reminded them of what they were called to do. And he returned the people back to God. They turned back to God during Samuel's time, leading up to the kings. And today we need, we live in just as chaotic a time as Samuel did. His chaos was caused by the Philistines. Ours is caused by, I won't say what ours is caused by, but anyway, we live in the same sort of radical worldwide problems. And the church needs leaders today just like Samuel was in his day. Bring the people back to God.
All right, so let's jump into 1 Samuel. Right here. On the day Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he would give a double portion. We just talked about double portions. You give double portions to people that are important. And to Elkanah, Hannah was important. Because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb, and her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. Moving on.
If you go back just a second.
Yeah.
When it gives the names of Elkanah and who he's descended from and everything, those are names of Levites. Elkanah was a Levite. That's why they would come annually they didn't just come to offer sacrifices, but he came also to serve in the temple. And that's why it was accepted when Hannah wanted to give her son Samuel to the temple in service at the age of 3, and Eli accepted him because he was from parents that were Levites. Eli actually was descended from Aaron. He was from the lineage of the high priest. So he was actually the rightful, one of the people that could be chosen as the high priest. Go ahead, Adam.
And so moving on to verse 9, we're trying to hit high points because we don't have a lot of time. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose, and now Eli the priest was sitting at the seat beside the doorpost in the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. Her vow, O Lord of hosts, once again that call of Lord of armies, if you will indeed look into the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. No razor shall touch his head. You think about judges. Remember the judge who didn't cut his hair? And it was detrimental to him? Not everybody at once. Samson, right? She's offering her son as a Nazirite. That his hair's not going to touch his head. He's going to be devoted to God in the same way that Samson was devoted to God. but a lot better than Samson.
Imagine you're a mother and you've prayed for a child just like Sarah prayed for a child, just like Rachel prayed for a child. They were both barren like Hannah was. And you go to God and say, if you will give me a son, I will turn him over to you. I will give him to you to serve you. What kind of faith does that take in a mother? Can you imagine moms turning Sam's about 3. That's about the age that they gave Samuel, when he was weaned to Eli. So, the tremendous amount of faith that she had. And knowing that Eli and his sons were not good men, and yet she trusted that God would make things turn out right. Look at Joseph and his circumstances. He was, sent off to Egypt, and yet God watched over him and protected him. The faith that was there was just tremendous. Go ahead, Adam.
Sorry, we're really behind. And so Hannah's before Eli. She's praying, and Eli accuses her of being a drunkard. And here's her response. No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as worthless. This word is important because it's going to be used in contrast with Hophni and Phinehas. She defends herself and says, I'm not a worthless woman. We get to a later chapter and we hit the ground running saying, Hophni and Phinehas were worthless. Same exact word here. And so, interesting contrast. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Eli answered her, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant you your petition that you have made him. Moving on. Yes?
He said, God will grant your petition, and the burden was lifted from her. She quit weeping. She went back. She ate the meal with her family and everything. So,
and her face was no longer sad.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, oh, okay, I guess God listened to me. I'm still going to mope around a little bit. She went back, and those burdens were really lifted from her.
Elkanah noticed a change. Go ahead.
All right. Do you want to talk about this?
I was just going to say, this was a quote from John Bunyan. In prayer, it is better to have a heart without words than words without a heart. That's kind of describes her prayer and what Eli saw. He saw her praying but didn't hear any words. He didn't understand that she was praying from her heart. And it's more important to have your heart involved in your prayer than to have all the right words and not have your heart involved. Go ahead.
All right. I think we're going to skip 1 Samuel.
Better skip it.
1 through 28. And so what ends up happening? She goes home and she conceives and has a son. From there, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we have Hannah's prayer. Now, what's interesting about this prayer is it's a chiasm. The structure and form is unique. It is poetry. A chiasm, if you were to take it in the original Hebrew and find themes and were to literally draw lines between the themes, the thing that intersected all of those lines would be the important idea. And so the chiasm here is in verse 1, Hannah prays and says, my heart exalts the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. In verse 10, at the end, he gives strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. He will give strength. We look at that green passage. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. It's God who judges the deeds, and he will guard the feet of his faithful one. He judges the deeds, and that judgment means he guards the people whose deeds are good. The blue, we have reversals here. There's 2 separate reversals. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. You have this reversal of roles. The same reversal, a similar reversal happens here. He raises up the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ashes to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. He does all this to highlight what's in purple. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. So the question becomes, why is it important at the beginning of Samuel that the author highlight this specific verse? Keep in mind, we're talking about a book about man's king, not God's king, why is it important that this verse be highlighted? Any takers? Zach said God's going to bring about what he wants. Okay?
It would also show that he's in control.
God's in control. Yeah. Right?
We're going to see as we get into Samuel also that he's going to kill Eli and his 2 sons and make their family poor. So it could be immediately referring to that, but, I think ultimately it may be referring to more.
What I find interesting, and later on in Samuel, you have Samuel warning the people that, hey, the people ask for a king. And Samuel tells the people, you've asked for a king, you've rejected God as your king, and this king is going to do things like ask taxes for you. He's going to take horses from your flocks. He's going to take wine from your vineyard. He's going to do all of these things. He's going to conscript your sons into armies. What I find interesting about this is when the king acts, it's God who put him there. Regardless of the king, it is God who put him there. And at any time, if God decides that king's not doing the right job, he can knock him down and bring somebody up, which is part of the story of Samuel. And so it's really important, I think, that we understand who's in power as we begin this search for a king with Samuel, as we anoint kings, as the kings misbehave. It is God who's really in power. And that's why I think this verse is important, why it's at the beginning of Samuel, why it's at the middle of this chiasm.
Another take on this prayer or song by Hannah, these 10 verses, it's actually 11 verses, but the 11th verse says that Elkanah, after leaving his son Samuel with Eli, returned to Ramah. So she is singing or praying this as she is leaving her son and returning home. And yet she is rejoicing in this prayer. And she is, we need to understand, she is making a sacrifice as a mother. And yet she is also, at the same time as the sacrifice, she is singing. So, sacrifice and singing go together. Think about Jesus. When he went to the garden, what did he do before he left for the garden and as they left the upper room? They sang a hymn. Well, he did pray, yes, Dave, but he sang a hymn. That's the point I'm wanting to make. When Paul was in prison, they were thrown in prison, they were beaten. What was one of the things they did? They sang. So these songs are natural outcomes of sacrifice if your mind is attuned with God. Okay, Adam.
All right, so still in 2 Samuel, now verse 12, we've left Elkanah and Hannah and Samuel, and we're back to Eli and his sons, and we describe them as worthless men. Same word that Hannah said, I'm not a worthless woman, but the writer says if Hannah wasn't worthless, Eli and Phinehas were worthless. What's interesting is the reason why they're worthless we find in verse 15. Just before verse 14, they do this to all the Israelites. Here's what they did. Moreover, before the fat was burned, so they haven't even sacrificed anything. They've slaughtered the animals. They've brought it to sacrifice. The priest's servant would come and say to the man who is sacrificing, give me meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat, but only raw. Verse 17, thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. And not just the people they didn't like, not just a single tribe they didn't like, all of Israel received the same treatment from Hophni and Phinehas. They disregarded God, didn't wait for the sacrifice and the fat to be burned to God, the sweet smell of the offering that God liked, the fat to be burned. They wanted it before God got anything, and that's really where they get themselves in trouble. Oh, there we go.
Go to verse 22.
21, she ends up bearing more sons and daughters, and Samuel grows up in the presence of the Lord. 22.
Not only were they sinful in the way they treated the sacrifices, you also had maidens that came and offered assistance in the temple, whether they were, babysitting the children while the adults went into sacrifice, whether they helped outside the temple with preparing things. We don't know what they did, but the problem is that these two sons of Eli, in verse 22, it said they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So they were seducing these women and causing them to sin. So that was also a great sin that they were guilty of. And the thing is, this guilt and this sin all around the temple was not sin just to other men, but it was sin against God. And that's what verse 25 is referring to. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. So,
if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? This is what Eli says. What's interesting is we have a similar continue on in chapter 12, verse 12, verse 27. Oy. A man of God came to Eli. This is similar to Nathan coming to David. Remember when Nathan sins with Bathsheba, Nathan comes to him and tries to talk some sense into him. A man of God comes to Eli and does the same thing and pronounces essentially, you have done evil. There's nothing that you can do to save yourself. At the very bottom, far be it from me, for those who honor me, I will honor. For those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Moving on. In the blue, your house shall die by the sword of men, and this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart. This man of God says, Eli's entire house is going to die. Not just Hophni and Phinehas. His entire house is going to die. But you're going to know I'm serious because Hophni and Phinehas are going to die on the same day in the future. The house we're talking about is everyone in green here on the right below Eli, save for one, and we'll get to that. But like we said, Eli is from the lineage of Aaron. Aaron ends up has 4 sons, 2 sons survive, Ithamar and Eleazar. And the priest that God loves, that's after his own heart, comes from Eleazar. It ends up being Zadok, and all of Eli and his family die. And we'll see that. We made this because we're going to revisit this theme. As we continue through Samuel, we'll see these guys in green die. And it's really important. Okay.
3 minutes to talk about God rewarding faithfulness.
1 if you look at your cell phone.
Oh, yes. That's 2 minutes late, isn't it? Yeah. 1 minute to talk about God rewarding.
Ready, go. Can I synopsis real quick?
Go ahead.
Samuel's laying next to the ark. It's the first time the ark is mentioned in Samuel. It's really important. Samuel hears a voice calling his name. He goes to Eli, says, "You have called for me." Eli says, "It's not me." It happens 3 separate times. And on the 3rd time, Eli says, next time someone says something to you, say, "Lord, your servant hears. What do you need?" And Samuel does that. It ends up being God. God speaks to what we think is a 12-year-old boy at this time and tells him, "I'm going to fulfill what the man of God told Eli. His entire house is going to die." Samuel is in the same lineage as Moses and Abraham and Jonah. A 12-year-old boy has spoken with God. Let that sink in. A 12-year-old boy. And that 12-year-old boy is sleeping next to the ark.
And he's then told to go tell that to Eli.
Yeah, and then he has to go tell his boss, "Oh, by the way."
But what he does, the next morning he wakes up, the first thing he does is go and open the door and start about his duties. He doesn't, most 12-year-olds, if they have some knowledge like that, the first thing they're doing is they're just jumping all over the place telling anybody they can. He goes about his duties. And Eli has to implore him, "Tell me what the Lord said to you." And he asked him more than once, and finally he tells him, and it confirms what the man of God, the prophet, had said to Eli.
And then lastly, what's interesting is this relationship grows so much that, verse 19, and Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, lowercase h, and let none of his words, uppercase h, God's words, or let none of his words, lowercase h, Samuel's words fall on the ground. So when Samuel asks God for something, God listens. And that's how we end chapter 3, is the presumed downfall of Eli and his entire house, and we essentially have a judge that has God's ear, and now we're going to enter chapter 4 with lots of fun turmoil and war and fun stuff.
Next week's lesson, we're going to look at the ark and talk more about it and about the good old Philistines. So this is a book on the Philistines in the Old Testament. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be an interesting class.
Thank you for your time.